Just weeks ago, the world watched as U.S. AFRICOM Commander General Michael Langley made a bold accusation, claiming that President Ibrahim Traoré was using Burkina Faso's gold to protect himself. At the same time, traitors, fugitives who plotted to destabilize Traoré's government, fled across the border. Their destination, Ivory Coast. And now, those two forces have aligned. General Langley recently met with the president of Ivory Coast, and out of that meeting came one chilling decision: the plan to establish a U.S. military base near Burkina Faso and Mali. The question is, why? Why is the U.S. so eager to build a military presence in Ivory Coast, a country currently giving refuge to men accused of plotting chaos in Burkina Faso? Is this really about fighting terrorism? Or is this a calculated move to surround and contain the growing anti-Western bloc in West Africa? Because let's be clear, this base isn't just close to Burkina Faso. It's strategically positioned between Traoré's Burkina Faso and Goïta's Mali, the very heart of the AES Alliance. Is this coincidence, or a sign that the West is feeling threatened by the rise of independent African powers? The timing, the location, the alliances, they all raise the same question. Is the U.S. preparing for peace or preparing for pressure? Let's find out. A few weeks ago, right after making that absurd accusation against President Traoré, U.S. General Michael Langley touched down in Ivory Coast. Officially, he was there for Flintlock 2025, AFRICOM's annual multinational special operations exercise held in Jacquesville. Over 500 elite troops from 38 countries participated. On the surface, it looked like a routine military drill, but behind closed doors, something far more strategic was unfolding. Langley wasn't just there to observe troops. He was there to negotiate the creation of a U.S. drone base, right next to Burkina Faso and Mali. So now the question becomes even more urgent. Why is the U.S. suddenly so interested in expanding military operations, and why so close to the AES bloc? During the visit, General Langley, alongside U.S. Ambassador Jessica Davis B.A., held high-level meetings with Ivorian Defense Minister Tene Birahima Ouattara and Chief of Defense Staff Lieutenant General Lassina Doumbia. The official line: to strengthen bilateral cooperation and support Côte d'Ivoire's role as a regional security leader. But here's the uncomfortable truth. What kind of security leader arms chaos? Ivory Coast has done little, if anything, to help stabilize neighboring countries like Burkina Faso, where real battles are being fought against terror groups. Instead, its president nearly plunged the entire region into war by rushing to send troops to Niger after the military coup, a move widely condemned as reckless and provocative. And now, Ivory Coast is sheltering traitors. Traitors from the Burkinabe military, men accused of plotting to overthrow President Traoré, have found safe haven. And worse, they've been given an operations center to continue their schemes. Is that leadership? Or is it the mask of leadership used to cover foreign interests? Because when the same nation that's hosting destabilizers is also negotiating U.S. drone bases, we have to ask, whose security are they really protecting? How can the United States, a nation that claims to fight terrorism, partner with a government that's actively fueling it? How can Ivory Coast, which shelters traitors from Burkina Faso and provides them with operational support, be called a regional security leader by the same U.S. military that denounces instability? Is the U.S. unaware of what's happening? Absolutely not. The U.S. knows, and that's exactly what makes this even more alarming. But really, should we be surprised? Because despite its loud declarations of defending democracy, human rights, and justice, the U.S. has always served one interest above all: its own. Throughout history, America has shown again and again that it will work with anyone. No matter how corrupt, no matter how brutal, as long as they're pro-West, they'll shake hands with dictators, fund regimes that starve their people, support leaders who jail, torture, and murder their own citizens. Just look at post-Cold War Southeast Asia, where the U.S. openly supported military regimes and authoritarian governments, pouring in money and weapons to fight so-called communism. The result? Mass murder, torture, assassinations, all with the U.S. seal of approval. So today, when we see America calling Ivory Coast a security partner while it harbors enemies of Burkina Faso, it's not about stability, it's about control. And that label, regional security leader, it's just the costume they put on a puppet. Now tell us, in any court of law, isn't someone who funds a crime just as guilty as the one who commits it? Of course, But when you're the United States, the law doesn't seem to apply. No charges, no consequences. Just press conferences and polished statements. What a distorted world we live in. So when the US military joins forces with Ivory Coast, a country sheltering enemies of Burkina Faso, it's not really surprising. The real question is, why? Because this partnership isn't about peace, it's about positioning. During a recent high-level meeting, both nations finalized plans to establish a US military drone base on Ivorian soil. But here's the twist. This plan didn't start yesterday. It began last year, right after Niger expelled US forces from its territory. Since then, General Langley has made several documented visits to Ivory Coast, not for ceremonies, but for strategy. His goal? To solidify a new alliance and replace lost ground in Niger with new ground in Côte d'Ivoire. At the center of this strategy, the drone base, a surveillance hub that can keep eyes on the AES bloc, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, all of whom are rejecting Western control. So let's be clear, this isn't about fighting terror, it's about containing resistance, and the US has found a willing partner in a leader ready to trade regional loyalty for foreign favor. Back then, a report by French outlet Monde Afrique claimed that a US drone base was being planned near Odiané in northern Ivory Coast. But when the story broke, AFRICOM's West Africa coordinator Kenneth Ekman was quick to deny it, claiming the US had not yet committed to building a formal base. That may be technically true, but here's the catch. According to multiple reports, the US operates dozens of unofficial, unacknowledged bases across Africa. Small, discreet outposts with no signs, no public records, and no accountability. And in many cases, not even the host country's government knows what's really going on inside them. Let that sink in. Foreign soldiers, foreign weapons, on African soil, operating in secrecy. How can any self-respecting government agree to such terms? What if those foreign troops are planning something else? What if the mission isn't just counter-terrorism, but surveillance, sabotage, regime change? This isn't security. This is occupation disguised as partnership. And the worst part? African leaders are letting it happen. They hand over land, turn a blind eye, then smile in front of the cameras, while their sovereignty is quietly sold off, base by base. It's not just pathetic, it's betrayal. And unless something changes, those who were elected to protect their people may end up helping to destroy them from the inside. Even if the US hasn't fully set up a drone base in Ivory Coast yet, make no mistake, the deal is done. General Langley's recent visit didn't just include handshakes and photo ops. It finalized plans for a drone base near the Ivorian borders with Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And officially, the reason sounds noble: to fight terrorism, to counter the threat of jihadist groups in the region. But is that really why the US wants a base right next to the AES Alliance? Absolutely not. Because General Langley himself, the head of US AFRICOM, has already told us the truth. During a session with the US Congress, he wasn't under the bright lights of the African press. He wasn't in uniform before African presidents. He was facing his own lawmakers, and he was asked a simple, direct question. Why is the US military in Africa? What are we doing there? Why are we spending taxpayers' money on military bases across the continent? And General Langley's answer? Access and influence. That's it. No mention of terrorism. No mention of helping Africans. No humanitarian mission. Just access and influence. This isn't about protecting Africa. It's about controlling it. So now, the pieces are falling into place. A base on the doorstep of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. A partner government sheltering enemies of African sovereignty. And a military strategy driven not by security, but by global positioning. This is not a war on terror. This is a war for dominance. And it's unfolding, one base at a time. For years, the US and its European allies, especially France, have insisted that their military presence in Africa is all about one thing: fighting terrorism. Stopping it, they claim, before it reaches their shores. But let's be honest, terrorism isn't coming to the US. After 9/11, America rewrote the rulebook on defense. Trillions poured into homeland security, surveillance systems, intelligence networks, global strike capabilities. And today, the US holds the largest defense budget in the world, by a massive margin. With that kind of firepower, no terrorist group in the Sahel is foolish enough to target the US mainland. They know it, and Washington knows it too. Instead, these jihadist groups focus on weaker targets, nations with fragile borders, limited defense, and internal divisions. nations in Africa, especially in the Sahel, where terrorism now thrives. But how did it get there? The answer takes us back to Libya, 2011. After NATO-backed forces toppled Muammar Gaddafi, the region descended into chaos. Weapons disappeared, fighters scattered, and from the ashes of a broken Libya, terrorists moved south. Their next stop? Mali. Already destabilized by the Tuareg rebellion, Mali became ground zero. From there, the violence spread like wildfire across Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and beyond. Not because Africa created terrorism, but because Africa was left exposed. The poorest nations, already overwhelmed by poverty and conflict, became the new battlegrounds. While the West built bases, gave speeches, and watched, the fires kept burning. So when they say they're here to protect Africa, ask yourself, protect who? From what? Because the real threat isn't just terrorism. It's the way global powers use that threat to justify occupation, to maintain control, to never leave. Now, back to the United States. As we've already said, terrorism is not reaching US soil, not with the kind of defense systems they've built. So the idea that the US military is in Africa to fight terrorism, that's a lie, a convenient one. In fact, let's say it boldly, the US is profiting from terrorism. Yes, we said it. And if you really think about it, it makes perfect sense. Imagine a world without terrorism, a world without armed groups slaughtering innocent people, a world where leaders like Ibrahim Traoré don't have to divert resources into war. In that world, the US military presence in Africa becomes irrelevant. Their trillion-dollar defense budget, unjustifiable. Their bases, pointless. And for countries in the Sahel, like Burkina Faso, development, not defense, would be the priority. But here's the uncomfortable truth. With all its satellites, drones, spies, and intelligence networks, the US knows exactly where the terrorists are. If it wanted to eliminate them, it could. But after over a decade of boots on the ground, drone strikes, and counterterrorism programs, terrorism hasn't decreased. It's evolved, it's spread, it's gotten smarter. Today, some terrorist groups in the Sahel have websites, social media pages, they upload videos, issue statements, operate like corporations. Worse still, they now carry weapons more advanced than some national armies. Where are those weapons coming from? How are they operating so freely in monitored zones? And why, after all these years, has no superpower been able or willing to stop them? Ask yourself, who really benefits from an unstable Africa? Because if peace breaks out, a lot of powerful people lose power. And yet, despite everything, the US military continues to justify its presence in Africa. But let's ask the obvious. If terrorism has only grown worse, what is the US military actually doing here? This question isn't just rhetorical. It's the reason Niger kicked them out. You see, most people don't know this, but when the US sets up a base in an African country, the agreements are shocking. According to the terms, the US has no legal obligation to help defend the host country in the event of an attack. Let that sink in. So if Ivory Coast were attacked tomorrow by jihadist groups, the US military could simply do nothing, despite having troops and drones just miles away. Even more disturbing, the host country has no right to demand intelligence from the US, no access to surveillance, no insight into what's really going on inside those secretive bases. And perhaps worst of all, the government of that country is forbidden from interfering in US military affairs. So tell us again, what purpose do these bases serve? Because it's clearly not about protecting African nations. It's not about peace. It's not even about partnership. And General Langley already confirmed it. In his own words, the US military is in Africa for access and influence. So what does access really mean? It means access to Africa's gold, uranium, lithium, cobalt, and oil. It means tapping into cheap labor and unregulated markets. It means establishing military outposts in strategic locations, not to help Africans, but to control Africans. Because a military base doesn't need to fight to be effective. Sometimes it just needs to be close enough to pressure or pounce. And that's what's really happening here. This isn't security, it's strategy. It's economic occupation wrapped in the language of counterterrorism. And African leaders, whether by ignorance or design, are signing away sovereignty one agreement at a time. Like Europe, the United States has its eyes locked on Africa's minerals. And it's no secret. Just recently, we watched as the US ramped up its involvement in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right after the DRC president offered access to the country's vast mineral wealth. So let's not pretend. The US wants Africa's gold, its cobalt, its lithium, its rare earths. And insecurity makes that access easier. Now imagine if the DRC were stable. If it had no armed rebels, no instability, no threat of war, would it have offered up its resources to Washington? Of course not. That's the game. And that's why we say, without apology, the US profits from terrorism. It doesn't want to end it. It wants to manage it. Because terrorism gives America something valuable: leverage. You see, with its unmatched military might, the US has a service to offer: security. And it doesn't offer it for free. From Africa to the Middle East, desperate nations ask for help, to train troops, to share intelligence, to protect borders. And in return, the US gets something even bigger: access to land, access to minerals, access to influence. It's not charity, it's business. And terrorism is good for business. So the next time you hear the phrase counterterrorism partnership, remember what it really means: a handshake with one hand and a contract in the other. Take Saudi Arabia, for example. Decades ago, when the kingdom faced a major security crisis, the US stepped in, offering its military might to protect the monarchy, but it didn't do it for free. In return, Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer, agreed to sell oil exclusively in US dollars. And just like that, the petrodollar was born. That single deal cemented the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, a global advantage Washington still enjoys today. And Saudi Arabia isn't alone. Time and time again, the US has used its military like a bargaining chip. You get protection, they get influence, but there's a catch. The US never finishes the job. It doesn't want you to be fully secure. It wants you to be dependent, just secure enough to function, but never enough to stand alone. It's a brilliant strategy if you think like a superpower. But for the countries involved, it's a trap. Which brings us to the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC's president seems convinced that the US will eliminate his country's insecurity. But here's the harsh truth: it won't. Washington isn't there to fight rebels. It's not there to secure the people. It's there to secure the mines, the roads, the export hubs. Anywhere there's cobalt, gold, coltan, or copper, you'll find the US presence. Everywhere else, silence. And so, we feel sorry for the people of the DRC, because once again, a short-sighted leader has traded sovereignty for a false promise. The question is simple: when will African leaders learn? But security isn't the only thing the US military exports. It also exports weapons, guns, drones, ammunition, missiles. The US defense industry is a trillion-dollar machine, and it doesn't just run on patriotism, it runs on conflict. Because if the world were at peace, if terrorism were truly defeated, who would they sell to? And that's the uncomfortable truth. To keep profits high, there must be war, there must be fear, there must be instability. And so weapons flow to governments, to private buyers, and yes, even to terrorist groups. So when we say that the US is fueling terrorism in Africa, it's not a conspiracy, it's a business model. Now let's talk about influence, because that was the other half of General Langley's confession. When he told Congress that the US is in Africa for access and influence, he wasn't just talking about minerals, he was talking about power projection. Nations like the US and France take pride in their military dominance. It's not just about defending borders, it's about making a statement. We are everywhere. By scattering military bases across Africa, they send a message: we control this space. This is our sphere. Every base becomes a flag, every drone, a symbol of global status. It's no longer just about defense, it's about dominance. It's about legacy. And Africa, it's being carved into military trophies for Western pride. This is why today, we're seeing countries like China, Russia, Japan, and even India begin to set up their own military outposts abroad. Military presence is the new currency of global power. But here's the most tragic part. Africa has become the breeding ground for these foreign ambitions. Nowhere else in the world hosts as many foreign military bases as Africa. From Djibouti to Niger, from Ghana to the Central African Republic, the continent is littered with outposts that don't serve African interests. Why? Because every rising power wants a piece of Africa, not to help it rise, but to use it as a launch pad for their own global status. And what do African leaders do? They open the doors. They roll out the red carpet. They accept the deals, without questioning the long-term cost. Where is the ambition? Where is the vision for Africa as a respected power, not just a passive partner? It's as if the only thing that matters is money and protection to stay in power. The situation is not just frustrating, it's pathetic. Now let's come back to the United States. Because the recent US push to set up a drone base near Burkina Faso is not a coincidence, it's a reaction. The US saw that China and Russia were gaining ground in the Sahel. New partnerships, new trade routes, new influence. So what does Washington say? We're setting up a base to counter Chinese and Russian influence. But what does that really mean? It means one thing: they're not afraid of terrorism, they're afraid of competition. Because the moment African nations start choosing their partners, the moment they start saying no to Western control, that's when the US panics. Not because Africa is in danger, but because their dominance is slipping. And so they respond the only way they know how. Not with diplomacy, not with fairness, but with military bases. As we've seen, the leaders of the AES Alliance have turned their backs on the West and chosen instead to walk with Russia and China. To the West, this isn't just a political shift. It's a threat, a sign that their grip on the Sahel is weakening. So, how do they respond? Not with dialogue, not with respect, but with surveillance. By setting up a drone base in Ivory Coast, they're not fighting terrorism. They're watching Burkina Faso, watching Mali, watching Niger, tracking every handshake, every convoy, every meeting with Moscow or Beijing. This base is about intelligence, control, containment, not peace. And in return, Ivory Coast gets a paycheck and a promise of protection. It's a familiar pattern, and frankly, it's pathetic. So we ask again, when will African leaders stand up for themselves? When will they say no to being used as pawns in a global chess game? When will they stop selling sovereignty? For comfort, these are the questions on our minds as we end this video. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Because the truth about Africa's fight for dignity and independence must be told, and we're here to tell it.